Okay, so we already talked about the Jacobites. We're going to be talking about what actually happened during slavery. Okay, so let's get into it. So this is talking about what happened with the Dutch and how the Dutch had a big effect on the transatlantic slave trade and how they impersonated a lot of the Jacobites and English in Britain. So this is from the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. Let's get into it. It says, in January 1617, the Dutch under Lawrence Ryle seized the English ships Swan, Captain Nicholas Courthrop, after a stiff fight in the road of Parleroon, one of the Banda Islands, and a ship later, the ship Defense, under the pretense that they had King James' order prohibiting the English from trading east of Celebes. And it says a particularly insulting pretext when they were at the very time committing piracy under the guise of Englishmen. So this is telling us right here is that the Dutch impersonated the English and committed piracy. Now we're going to see this is a very consistent thing, that the Dutch were impersonating the English, and we're going to see why, in fact, slavery was not even legal in Britain. So it says, against the Dutch, while the Britain East Company was a rival of the Dutch, fighting between the English and the Dutch trader had broken out in 1617. News of the execution of 10 English traders by the Dutch officials on an island of Amboina. So this is the famous year, the 1619, and we find out that what actually happened before they went to go take the Negroes in the known 1619 date. What they did first is they actually killed Englishmen, and we're going to find out the Englishmen they targeted were Jacobites. And now to what happened in 1619 in Jamestown when slavery first started, these same Dutch that were fighting the English came to enslave the Negroes. It says about the letter 1619, and this is from John Ruff in 1619. He says, a Dutchman of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived in Port Comfort. I want to get down and get to the point here, and it says, he brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes with the governor and Cape Merchant bought for victuals, whereof he was in great need, as he pretended at the best at the easiest rate they could. So it's talking about how he was selling them. The Dutch were selling the Negroes. They were buying them. They were enslaving people and we saw that they have a habit of going under the guise of English. So the reason why I brought up those facts is to show that already pre-1619, there's already a habit of the Dutch impersonating the English. The Dutch are the first ones to enslave Negroes. The Dutch did not like the Jacobites. Okay? Now we're going to get into this a little bit even more, and this is from nps.gov, and this is the Royal African Company. And we hear a lot of stories about the Royal African Company, that it was the stewards that actually started it and they enslaved a lot of people. But we're going to go again to the sources and we're going to see what actually happened. So this is the Royal African Company. This is nps.gov. And it says, as early as 1618, King James I granted a patent to a company that wanted to trade for gold and precious woods in Africa. Other golds also received right to trade in Africa, but never dealt with slaves in any major way. English involvement in the slave trade would intensify after 1663, when a new patent was issued to the company. So during King James' time, Royal African Company wasn't doing the whole slave thing. until 1660, 1663. So it's important to get that understanding. Now we're going to look a little further into the Royal African Company. And the source we're going to be reading from is a member of the Royal African Company who would have the records. And it says, the Dutch supplanted us both and have monopolized that valuable commerce to themselves. About 1660. Now remember, it says in that source we just read that slavery didn't start for real until 1663. The Dutch likewise attempted to gain the entire possession of the most valuable parts of the African coast and to exclude Great Britain from any share or interest therein. Notice they started to try and take over in 1660s, same time slavery started to happen. As they have done in the spice trade, and thereby brought on themselves a war with this kingdom in 1664. So we see consistently, anytime the Royal African Company, the Jacobites are trying to do something, the Dutch are always there to interfere. Before the late Royal African Company of England had built a sufficient number of forts and castles on the Gold Coast, the Dutch interrupted our trade and seized and confiscated our ships on that coast, and wherein its dependencies, since the company have built and maintained a sufficient number of forts and castles on the Gold Coast. The companies and all other British ships and vessels have traded freely to this coast, and all places depend therein, without molestation from the Dutch or any other nation. Under the article English African Company, we have given a short history of the African trade in general, and here it may be useful to observe more minutely how this nation was annoyed by the Dutch in this branch of trade, and what struggles we have had to preserve any share in it. So I'm reading this to show that during the time when slavery came in 1663, already in 1660 the Dutch were starting to take over the Royal African Company. Now the source we're reading is from the Royal African Company themselves. We're going to take this a step even further. This is another source from another member of the Royal African Company, 1710. This is the source we're reading from. Check this out. It says, when in the reign of King Charles II, the trade to Africa was, by reason of the late Dutch war, in most immediate danger of being inadvertently lost to this nation. The only method then thought proper and expedient for recovering and improving the trade to a national security and advantage was that a reclusive charter with suitable privileges should be given to all such persons indefinitely as would contribute towards the raising of new joint stock. So basically what's going on, they're bothering them so much, the Dutch, that they ended up giving them their own trade, allowed them to trade for the foresaid end, and thereupon considerable members of advantages and several ranks and qualities, having by suspicion raised a suitable joint stock. The king in the year 1672 granted them the royal charter according by the nation of the Royal African Company of England. So basically they gave them their own independent trade because they kept on bothering the people of England so much, because they kept on trying to interrupt the trade. They're like, we'll push you aside, we're going to give you your trade so you can leave us alone. So now just putting in a yay term because they speak of Old English, and it says here, while the company had the privilege of their charter supported by the countenance of protection of the government, they carried on the trade with a very great and extraordinary success. So they had success. The British interest of the coast of Africa was very considerably improved. Their forts and settlements increased and maintained, and making of diverse forts of new manufacturers here in England encouraged by the constant yearly exportation of great quantities thereof. The plantations plentifully supplied with Negroes at very moderate rates. So they did supply their plantations with Negroes, not that much. It was a very moderate rate. Now we're going to see what this means, and if there were slaves, and if they got paid, or if they were just workers. So check it out. It's besides great returns of gold or on valuable goods. So besides the gold, valuable goods imported, vast numbers of hands. When it says number of hands, just understand what that means. That means workers comfortably employed both at home and abroad. And in short, the whole trade was then carried on and improved in all the branches thereof by such a uniform and orderly management as produced. So these people were paid. So they traded goods, but they didn't trade people. They employed them. And they gave mutual peace. They were comfortably employed. All right. And it was to the benefit of both people, to Africa and to that spot where they were at. It says, as produced mutual benefits and satisfaction to the nation, the plantations, and all parties concerned. So everybody had mutual benefit. They were employed. This is not chattel slavery. This is not even an indentured servants. This is them supplying, because it's even at their place or not. They're just employed. They can say yes or they can say no. There's nothing in here that says indentured. So this is what the Jacobites were doing. But it says, but some interlopers, becoming envious of the company's success, assumed a lascivious liberty of breaking it upon the company's privilege by trading to Africa ever since the revolution. So the revolution, something happened during the revolution, and we're going to see what happened. We're going to read the rest of this. Without any manner of refinement, counsel, and others by example following the same course, and pretended to justify. So it says the revolution without any course and restraint and counsel, and others by example following the same course and pretending to justify their proceedings. Now, what happened in the revolution? We're going to find out that it's the Dutch. We're going to find out that they invaded and then they took over the Jacobite lands in Britain. We're going to read into that, but that's what the revolution is about. Now keep reading. By alleging that no regard ought to be had to the company's charter, since it was not confirmed by the Act of Parliament. In the year 1697, the company, finding themselves very much aggrieved and their trade discouraged and brought into disorder, applied to the Parliament for opposition, and yet by clamorous importunities and bold, though groundless, assertions of the interlopers. So now we're going to find out what actually happened during this, because they say it seems like everything kind of went downhill after the revolution, and the Dutch started to get control over the company yet again. Now let's see what this revolution is. So it says here the revolution is at its weakest for the Dutch intervention in Britain not only set the glorious revolution in motion, making possible the landing at Torbay and William III subsequently triumphant entry into London in 1688. And then it says, but continued to be an essential factor in all the main development in England, Scotland, and Ireland, at least down to the final suppression of armed Jacobite resistance to the Williamite regiment towards the end of 1691. One certainly cannot explain and continual neglect of the Dutch role in terms of its having been in any way inconspicuous for the Dutch invasion of Britain. So now that we see what actually happened in the revolution, let's go back to the Royal African Company. Let's keep reading. The Parliament was then prevailed upon for an experiment to grant a permission to all Her Majesty's subjects indistinctly. Now remember, this is an experiment and they're known for putting things on other people. Kind of like what's been done in history. Hopefully it's starting to click now. Hopefully it's really starting to click now. As well as the company to trade to and from Africa for the space of 13 years. They paying to the company a duty of 10% upon their exports. Okay, so they pretty much took over, and there wasn't even a distinctive control that their own kings or queens themselves that were of the stewards had a control over the whole company. So the company being willing to give all manner of satisfaction to the Parliament, and the nation thought fit to waive in some parts the privileges of the charter by acquiescing to that method for a trial, but by their dear bought experience have found the same intended with very many mischievous and pernicious consequences. Now remember that they completely took over the Royal African Company. Now this is how they ran it. It says very mischievous and pernicious consequences, whereof the following inconveniences are some instances: ships that belong to traders of different interests. Now different interests. Now it's called malicious and of different interests. Now let's see what those different interests are. Coming to trade and purchase Negroes. Now we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Now notice how they address it, that they had different interests in purchasing Negroes, meaning that's not what they were doing. When the Dutch took over, that's when you get slavery coming in. And we're hearing it from the source itself. This is the Royal African Company telling its own story. Let me keep reading. At the same place is the chief occasion of the natives' intolerable advance in their price and their depreciating our goods to the inexpressible detriment of not only the company but also the generality of the separate traders themselves, and tends only to the advantage of the natives in Guinea. Now I want to get a real good understanding of what they're saying right now, and I want y'all to look over this and really get a grasp and understanding of what they're communicating to us. They're saying because they started selling slaves, but the Jacobites were trying to sell goods. The issue is that a lot of the kings and some of the people in Africa, and we're going to show this is proof. This is a big statement that I'm making. The people in Africa valued their goods more than they did some of their people. So if the Jacobites were trying to trade goods with the people in Africa, they're like, okay, well, it's costing me my goods when I trade with the Jacobites, but when I trade with the Dutch, I can get more goods from the Dutch, and I don't have to give up any of my goods. All I have to do is give up these people that I don't even like, causing the Jacobites' goods to depreciate. Now, I'm going to show you that that's actually the case, because those people that they didn't like were Jews. This is how the transatlantic slave trade was specifically started, with black people that were Jews in America, and why so many people in the Americas are Jews. Check this out. This is a very important moment in history. It says, who by means thereof do turn the slavery upon us. Now, you just read about them enslaving Negroes and them changing the game up. And he said that as a result of that, that depreciated their goods. Now, I'm going to read on from where we left off. It says, their interfering interest are the unavoidable occasion of long and tedious voyages for want of that regular and quick dispatch on the coast of Guinea, and that the nature of the trade and wholesomeness of the climate does not necessarily require. So he's saying that they, their interests are unavoidable, and the way that they did things, wholesomeness wasn't required. Now, there's the source right there. You guys can read it for yourself and really read it closely. Now, the way that it's worded is different because they spoke different, but really get an understanding of what it's saying, because it's a lot. Now, I'm going to show you guys that it is a fact that they did not value some of their people, and they viewed them as different people. Now, I know this is a different type of subject, especially amongst our people, but I'm going to show you by eyewitnesses that is in fact a fact what this Royal African Company is stating, primary source. So now we're reading from these linguists right here, and we're reading from this manuscript as dated to 1506. Okay, and it's from this commercial agent and translator. He's born in 1450. So this is before the traditional 1619, because a lot of the trading in slaves, in a minute point, happened prior to 1619. The organizing of slaves, it was very organized, the transatlantic slave trade. First it was organized, and then it was carried out. So we're going to go into the details on how they view some of their people. It says, in this country and in Mandinga, that's Africa, there are Judeans. He's talking about Jews, and they are called Gaul, and they are black like their countrymen. However, they do not have synagogues and do not practice the ceremonies of other Jews. So these are Jews. We're talking about black Jews. They do not live with the other blacks, but in separate villages. These Gaul are often buffoons and play the viol and cavicas and are singers. And because they do not dare enter into the village, they hide behind the compound of the village nobles and sing his praises until dawn. And they are given a ration of millet, and then they leave. And when the nobleman leaves his home, the Judeans go ahead of him, singing and crying their buffooneries. The blacks treat them, Judeans, like dogs, and they do not dare enter into any home except that of the nobleman. And if they are found in the village, they are beaten with sticks. We're going to go to another account. It's a man born in 1550. So he would have lived his life going towards more than likely, the 1600s, right? And it says, of the sort which is like a harp. When these Jews die, they do not bury them in the ground like other blacks, but leave their bodies in holes in trees So we were hung on trees in America. Don't you know that they were also hung on trees in Africa? And you remember how the World African Company said that they turned the slavery upon us. You notice how these people are called Gaul. Some of them are Gaul, some of them are actual Negroes that are Jews as well there. But in general, whether you're a Jacobite Jew, Gaul, or a Jew in general, you're slave. They enslaved you because they didn't like Jews. It says they hang their bodies in the trees. It says in the hole in the trees, if there are none, they hang their bodies in the trees, because the other blacks hold the erroneous belief that if Jews are buried with other persons, the rain will not come and there will be no new crops on the land that year. So human beings that are being treated like that are regarded as dogs, hung on trees, treated like nothing, regarded as nothing. Of course, you have no problem selling them as slaves. This is what happened. This straight what happened. So this is before we got to America on trees. I'm sure that the Caucasian man, he took it a step further, did some extra stuff, but there's certain traditions that were in Africa that actually the white man didn't come up with himself. He got it from those other people who were treating these same Jews that way before they got to America. Again, we're reading eyewitness accounts. It is what it is, guys. This is essayist James Hogg, born 1770. Now he has a collection of Jacobite relics, and we're going to read these quotes from these Jacobites. He says, "Let all who value freedom's cause and slavery despise." So you've been wondering, were these Jacobites, did they hold slaves? Nope. It says, "and slavery despise. Rejoice for him that saved our laws." Now we're peeping why there was slavery in Britain, but yet on the books, slavery was illegal. Wait a minute. You see how we're uncovering this right now? Because the true Britons, the true people who own Britain, the Jacobites, are the only ones that could pass those laws. The Dutch couldn't. Even though they took it over, they weren't official enough to pass the laws. So they never did. But they had slaves anyway. Now we're going to read more from the Jacobites. "And cursed be they who helped on that wicked revolution." Now remember what happened after the revolution. The Dutch, the Royal African Company was taken over. They started exchanging slaves. We also found that they started exchanging Gaul slaves, which would be pertaining to the Jacobites. So this is matching that. It says, "Cursed be they who helped on that wicked revolution. Cursed be these treacherous traitors who by their perfidious knavery have brought our nation now into an everlasting slavery. Cursed be the parliament that day who gave their confirmation." And it says, "Keep out Hanoverian lines. 'Tis only James has divine right." So they wanted King James II to be the lawful successor. Now it says here, the lawful successor, what? You see what he calls him? Pretender. "Whom heaven has ordained the true heir dare oppose. Jimmy, who taught the Scots rebel alliance and made the High Dutch to his standard to lower." So they're saying basically they feel betrayed because they took this pretender and made the Dutch the high standard. Now remember, of course they honored James, so why wouldn't they honor James' son? Why would they call him that? And why would they say that it has something to do with the Dutch? Because a lot of people say that, oh, he was the pretender because he didn't have the right, because of politics, because of that. Had nothing to do with any of that. It's more straightforward than that. The reason why they called him the pretender, because he wasn't the real descendant of King James II. speaking about James Francis Edward. Now we're going to read a source from when he was alive from scholar Sir John Wildman. All right, we see he was born in 1621. So this is an eyewitness account, and here's what he says. It says here, and that a counterfeit son might be resolved on to be set up for Prince of Wales, as common fame confidently reported. The collections and observations we have since made of the things that occurred during the Queen's supposed pregnancy and about her pretended delivery of this son have made the truth of the matter so plain in our apprehensions that now we no more suspect but conclude and believe this pretended Prince of Wales to be a mere counterfeit. That is. So they're basically saying that this man, and you see that the Jacobites said that this is the influence of the Dutch, and which, oh, come on, I mean, the Dutch just, they keep it coming. The pretender is not the real lineage of King James II. Now, we're also going to read another thing about the Dutch. It's something that they claim that is definitely something that is going to allow us to understand why these Dutch had so much animosity for the Jacobites and also the Negro Israelites that were brought to America. Now, this is this historian here, and it says from 1617 and the 27th of November, the Hollanders proclaimed war. Now, the Hollanders are the Dutch against all the English at the Moluccas bands, and Amboyna threatened to make one and all prizes and to put them to the edge of the sword. Now the threat, there they go, threatening the people of England again. And it says, which proclamation of theirs they fixed upon the doors of their lodging at Baton, challenging all to be theirs as their proper inheritance. Now I'm gonna read that again. It says, challenging all to be theirs as their proper inheritance. Why are you going, you all the way in Holland, in Dutch in Holland? Why are you going all the way to England and claiming it as your own inheritance? Why are you claiming other people's stuff? It goes a little bit deeper than that, guys. Because if you notice, King James, after 70 AD, his lineage, as we went over in the other video, those Jews dwelt they migrated to Europe. Now, even though the original people in Europe a long time ago were brown races, but when the Jews entered into Europe around a little bit after 70 AD, a lot of the people were white that these Jews encountered. You look at the ancient Gauls, they were white people. This is facts. So, as we went into the other video as well. So, these Dutch people have an ancient Roman origin, because before it was taken over by the Jews and the Moors, we're going to show that the Dutch actually descend from one of those ancient dynasties. Check it out. This is historian, professor of ethnicity, Department of Government. This is him right here. And he says the Dutch, however, claim to be descended from the ancient Batavians. Okay, boom. So the Batavians, okay. And we see here from the dictionary that, again, that they are the genuine offspring of the Batavians. Okay. All right, so we see that. Now we're going to read something from the historian Tacitus. He was born in 56 AD, and he says, Julius Pallas, or Julius Clivis, were by far the most distinguished among the Batavians. being both of royal stock, on a false charge of revolt, Paulus was executed by Fonteius Capito. Civilis was put in chains and sent to Nero. Now, the reason why I read that is to show, first of all, that Julius Paulus is a Batavian and that he's of the royal stock, royal family in the time of Nero. Nero's the royalty at that time where he was at, that there will be connection with the Batavians and Nero. Now we're going to see, and we're going to expand and draw an even closer bridge to that connection. Now this is an archaeologist. Now he speaks of that same person, Julius Clavis. He says of the Batavian community at the time of Nero. It says members of the royal family. We are going to read here what it says, and it says Clavis is more likely to have inherited citizenship from his father, in which case his brother Paulus. Now remember Paulus? We just read about those two people who are of the Batavian dynasty. But we also read that Paulus would have carried the Julian family name. For this reason, I suggest that Julius Paulus and Clavis. So now we read here from this archaeologist that this same man is in the Batavian family. The Batavians are a branch off of the Julian family. I hope that's clear. We just confirmed about archaeology and Tacitus, which I would say is a good source. And the Batavians are Julians. And now the same archaeologist states Nero, the last of the Julio line. An historian says Nero was the sixth and last of the Julian line. So Nero was of the same line of the Batavians. So the same people that were persecuting the Jacobites, check this out. Come to find out, who are Israelites, is the same people who have the same bloodline as Nero. Now, where does Nero come from? They subtract from 450 AD, and it states here, Nero then conducted another test. He said to a child, "Tell me a verse that you learned today." He said to him as follows, "And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel." Nero said, "The Holy One, blessed be he, wishes to destroy his temple, and he wishes to wipe his hands with that man, i.e. with me." It says the Romans are associated with Edom. Now the verse that he read about was doing away with Edom. And Nero identifies himself as being an Edomite. So they have origins in ancient Rome. So they wanted to regain their land back. They wanted a rebirth. Hence you get the term Renaissance. We're going to get the person who started the inspiration for this Renaissance, reading from this anthropologist. And he says that Petrarch laid the foundation for the rebirth, now known as the Renaissance. Let's read from Petrarch, his book called Africa. And this is what he says. "'Tis rather my intent." This is his intent. So this is the motivation of the man who started the Renaissance. "To utterly destroy the cursed race of Africa and curb their powers' access with the assistance of a Sunnian Mars." That's what it is. Had nothing to do with classical art. In the other video, we showed an eyewitness account that the Jacobites originated from Africa. And that's why there's so much animosity. Very important to understand how that actually worked. So we're going to be reading an eyewitness account from 1691, uncontested words from that time. And we're going to be reading about King Louis. Right? Yeah, King Louis. Particular king right here. You know what's so important about him? He really actually kicked off a lot of slavery. The line that he supposedly comes from is actually a Frank. So it's actually black people, supposedly. This man that keep the slave codes around the Caribbean. I mean, he really did the whole thing with the slaves. Now we're going to find out about how people felt about him, because you see the title here. So when black royalty started getting replaced, there's a lot of fraudulent stuff going on. Now let's hear what they say. It says, we find in Holy Writ that in the Jewish law, it was especially provided by the supreme legislator that a bastard should not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. But it seems the unhappy kingdom of France allowed the bastard himself not only to enter into the congregation, but to settle himself upon the throne and to bear it higher than all the preceding kings before him, which had a better right to do it as being the offspring of kings. So he's saying that why is he getting more benefits than a lot of the other kings, and he doesn't have any of a legitimate right? The kings that came before him, they the real offspring of kings. He's not. Check it out. And not the son of the people. The proper term the Roman law gives to bastards. We have heard of the Salic law enforced in that kingdom for a great many ages. You can read this whole thing yourself. It's really like, it's wild. So we're going to be reading another source here. It says, well handed into the light. What dismal tragedies, as our French impostor caused in Christendom. How many cities laid in ashes, countries ruined, families extinguished, and millions of lives sacrificed to the vanity and ambition of a bastard. The Hognots of France, of all people in the world, have most reason to be ashamed of their conduct with relation to this ungreat monster in the time of his minority. So we're saying that basically he's not of our people and he's a minority among us. I want y'all to understand, man, but this guy somehow he weaseled his way to the throne. Now the details, there's a lot of different speculations. You can read this whole account yourself. They have a bunch of speculations of how he got there, but the point is he got there somehow. And they knew. Now this is different. This is different than a lot of the allegations, because there were allegations put on King James and other kings, right? This was written while he was still alive, and he never responded. This is different than King James. They waited till he was dead to just lie in his name, because they know he wasn't going for that. As for Louis, you know what his response was? Absolutely nothing. Because he didn't have a right to bear rule. Because he did not descend from the kings. And he's one of the major slave holders of all France. A lot of times when you even think of slavery, you refer to this king. So the Negroes and the blacks in Africa weren't the only people complaining about him. In Europe, the Jacobites were also complaining about him too. Where did this guy come from? Who let him rule? Okay, so we're reading from the rector of the United Churches, Joseph Cannell, born circa 1673 AD. And this is sermon right here, eyewitness account. And it says, or of any pretenders in opposition to the undoubted and legal title of the Queen. So some things we get from this is that, number one, there were pretenders assuming the thrones around Europe. Number two, they were in opposition to the authentic, original royal queen that was ruling at that time as well. And the queen ruling at that time is Queen Anne. And the pretenders, the fakes, were in opposition to the real one. And it also goes on to say here, is besides the folly and ingratitude of it, highly disadvantageous and detrimental in all respects to us. So these pretenders assuming the thrones is disadvantageous and detrimental to the original people. Now we're going to keep on reading more. And it says here that, and no discovery might be made to prejudice it. Thus, the birth of this pretender appear spurious and contrived by the fruitful invention of the Jesuits. Spurious is something fake. And it says that this is the invention of the Jesuits. So let's find out how the Jesuits are identified in these times. The source we're going to actually be reading from is a major source. This is from the one who requested to have initiated the translation of the King James Bible. I'm talking about John Reynolds, one of the translators of the King James Bible. And this is his book, The Prophecy of Obadiah. And this is what he says: but howsoever the Jesuits make show of wisdom and knowledge, yet God can take both wisdom and knowledge from them, as we see he hath done, both in their doctrine, discipline, and ceremonies, especially wherein their folly most notably appeareth, lest any man read their pontifical. The there it's talking about, we're still talking about the Jesuits. Context. It's pointing that out. And it says, and let him say whether God hath not taken all their, again, there is the Jesuits, is what we're talking about, wisdom from them. So this is what he's saying and said about them. Lord, finish thy work which thou hast begun. Take wisdom and strength from the mount of Esau, that Mount Zion may rejoice. So he's telling us that there's a scripture written about the Jesuits, and it's Esau. So he's referring to the Jesuits as the descendants of Esau. So if we take this eyewitness account who lived at that time, and then we take the other eyewitness account that was living at that time, stating that there were pretenders going around, assuming the thrones in Europe, and they identified these pretenders as the inventions of the Jesuits. And here we have the requester of the initiation of the King James Bible and a translator himself identifying these Jesuits as the descendants of Esau. So reading from this guy here, Thomas Cartier, born in 1686 AD. He's an historian and an eyewitness to the reign of Queen Anne. And he's also a Jacobite. And he says this: we have had our day. It ended with Queen Anne. Since her time, all has been confusion and discontent at home, folly and false politics abroad. Not to mention that spirit of slavery and irreligion that is spreading itself throughout the several parts of the three kingdoms. These are undeniable truths. And he says, what then have we to hope? Tells you right there, the Jacobites never approved of slavery, but those who invaded England started this slavery. This ecclesiastical journal from different time periods in Edinburgh, where King James was born, this source at Oxford says it like this: or between the swarthy Negro of old and the white man of the New World. So, we are going to be reading here about Queen Anne in the next segment. Stay tuned. And I read this in Isaiah 45:17. But Israel shall be saved in Yahweh with an everlasting salvation. Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end. Shalom.